Great. I might I'll just begin by welcoming Denis, welcoming everyone to the International Council for Traditional Music Study Group for Music and Dance of Oceania seminar series. And I'll begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking from Gundungurra lands in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, and pay my respects to traditional owners from the different places we're joining. Yes, so Denis is joining us. He's a musician and studied classical guitar performance, and has travelled and taught music at the University of Papua New Guinea. He moved to Macquarie University, where he's currently based, and his research has explored Papua New Guinean string band and popular music and the nature of the music industry in Melanesia and Australia. And he has a book that explores music and socio-political context of the band Sangoma, who mixed ancestral musics with jazz and rock. And Denis currently leads an Australian Research Council grant titled Music, Mobile Phones and Social Justice in Melanesia, involving ethnographic work in Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu and New Caledonia, with an applied component developing regionally relevant open source music production and media sharing software. And he's also working on a book exploring music software, and is an active guitarist and has performed and recorded with Torres Strait musician Seaman Dan and Norfolk Islander George Tully Christian, and continues to perform in Sydney and is dedicated to the popular music of Papua New Guinea. So thanks, Denis, for presenting and being first for the year to begin the seminar series. And I'll pass over to you.
Thanks very much, Georgia. And thanks very much for organising this, and yeah, wonderful to see people here at various times that you are. And thanks for the acknowledgement. I'm on, like I said, I don't know if that came across, on Darug Nation land, the Wadamarugal clan here at Macquarie University. So thank you. So today I'd like to give a sense of how a particular trajectory of research over the last few years is shaping plans for some further collaborative work, and why that is centred on ideas about music's role in social reproduction, and ideas about ownership and authorship in particularly Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, and possibly New Caledonia. I'm not sure I'll get to that today. That depends on some other colleagues, and how that relates to developments in copyright legislation and associated infrastructure in Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu more specifically. I'm drawing extensively today on work by Monica Stern and also James Leach. So I'm in the process of building arguments and drafting documents and sections that can be used for possible grant applications, possibly in Australia, possibly in France, overseas in Europe, with Monica and James and some other people as collaborators. So I'm extremely grateful for their collegial enthusiasm and support as these ideas develop. And a lot of that enthusiasm came from a workshop which we held in November that I'll briefly discuss. So I guess the kind of format of what I want to do today is talk about several articles and research projects, this workshop, and how that kind of leads, as I say, to shaping some of these ideas about authorship and ownership. So in November 2022, we held a workshop which was funded by the Australia-France Social Science Collaborative Research Program, which was a collaboration co-organised and funded by the French Embassy in Australia and the Academy of the Social Sciences. And the aim of our workshop was to investigate the reception of intellectual property legislation on music and artistic production across, obviously for purposes of getting the grant, French and English-speaking Melanesia, so Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. So the idea was to build on recent work that Monica Stern and I had done together, and that from the grant that Georgia mentioned, Heather Horst, on music sharing in Melanesia. And this was also linked to work that James Leach and Monica Stern have done on commerce and copyright in the arts of the region. And kind of, it's an extension of James's sort of ongoing work on IP and some of the complexities around that. And so a key focus is concern around the nature and challenges of implementation of copyright in relation to existing practices. And that subject is particularly topical in Vanuatu, as they have not only put in place legislation for the protection of intellectual property rights with the creation of an organisation called the Vanuatu Intellectual Property Office since 2012, I believe. But there's also a project establishing a copyright management society office there, which was officially approved in 2017. Now in Papua New Guinea, much larger population, although copyright legislation has been enacted, there's no local collection agency yet. And so the participants, main participants of that workshop were James Leach, Monica Stern, but probably most importantly, we invited Jean-Pierre Sam, who is a nationally recognised Ni Vanuatuan musician, one of the initiators of Vanuatu rap in the 1990s, and was involved in kind of several major festival committee organisation in the country, Fesnap One, and currently works at the Copyright Office in Vanuatu, focusing on music. And then we also invited Stan Antas, who's a prominent Ni Vanuatu musician, who's just played a very prominent role in lobbying various aspects of government for what's the development of a national music industry policy. And so somewhere here, this was our workshop. This is Stan, that's Jean-Pierre. And then discussions, and probably one of the highlights, I think, for all of us was taking kava at the with the Chancellery, Macquarie University Chancellery in the background, which was a lovely moment for all of us. And so here we have a document which is Vanuatu has a national music policy. It's worth noticing here, come back to it, is that it's kind of industry focused. I think my Zoom thing is covering that, but I think that says, is it the Department of Industry? Anyway, a very sort of industrial focus, and I'll return to that a little bit later on. Anyway, the more we kind of spoke with, people connected, or musicians and people connected to young people in Vanuatu making music, and we always spoke about ownership and authorship and shared, say, experiences that James and I had from Papua New Guinea and from the work of others. It became really clear that there was sort of space and willingness for a great deal more to be thought about, other than just the kind of, what I see, I guess, is a kind of international treaty-driven approach to getting copyright working, whatever that really means, as a result of TRIPS or, these international treaties. And yeah, so we're currently shaping some work from that. And there are some key ideas that I want to set up as to how this is important. And the first is to draw on an article by Monica way back in 2014, and so based on research from about a decade ago. And Stern pointed out that some of the aims of musicians that in Vanuatu, some of their aims for distribution and reception, where that sat in relation to commerce. So me want music belong me, me belong everyone. I want my music to be for everyone. And so these were kind of, I wouldn't say early, but sort of earlier than now, at least in terms of digital developments with the circulation of music by phones. And so recognising music as being a constituent part of social relations, Stern states that, quote, As long-standing traditional practices, music circulation and exchanges are socially important and cannot be reduced to commoditisation alone. And further, how digital music circulation can be seen as an extension of local cultural practices. And that's in broad alliance with other work from P&G, for example. Kirsty with us here today, amongst others, so Ollie Wilson, have shown how continuity of musical practices related to value creation and sustenance operate in rapidly changing social circumstances, where ultimately, and a quote from Kirsty's 2010 book, musical moments are components of events that are always enacted as part of a value creation process, asserting identity, modernity, attachment to place, religion, tension, and desire. Gillespie also argues against setting up dichotomies between traditional and modern, and focuses on agency and the dynamics of creative expression as parts of this value creation process. And this really I found very resonant because in speaking to James Leach through that workshop, sort of anthropological notions of value were really prominent in our discussions. And so there are tensions here between the non-commercial aspects of that value creation and the tenets behind international treaty-driven pressure to implement what really are essentially global North ideas of IP and copyright for commercial purposes. So this is quite a long quote from Monica Stern, but I'm going to read it anyway because I think it's really important. So in the traditional system of Vanuatu, music brings prestige and marks hierarchical status. The majority of urban youth come from economically underprivileged backgrounds with little formal education. In Vanuatu, music in the form of pop and reggae is not a commodity. It seems to bring the same prestige as custom music, KASTOM, Islama, because it enables musicians to enhance their image, helps them to build new social networks, allows them to acquire status and express themselves through the possibility of public performances, as well as providing the means of traveling or even sort of, casual income. And she points there to concerts rather than payment for recordings. And so as music in Vanuatu has always circulated according to local rules, and more recently in the copy market, so the digital distribution market, if you like, it is difficult for young people circulating music using digital media to accept the fact that they are now taking part in illegal practices, especially because they do not have the financial means to acquire music in the official way. However, it seems that everyone agrees that people should be able to ask for the music they like for free. And here digital technologies are adapted to local uses. So there's some sort of, a decade ago, Monica was pointing out the problems here. How recorded music in digital forms are used in local ways that align with local values about sharing, status, identity, and so on, even though recognizing there are issues of economic justice there, but I'll put that to one side for the moment. And so importantly, Stern predicted tensions that might emerge as copyright was implemented. And, these implementation processes take time. And so, but that's where we kind of are now. And so the processes of local distribution is central here, and they are local inflections of global phenomena, of course. And I want to turn now to Papua New Guinea and share a story about my experiences, at least, of how music is circulating and what that brings to this discussion. So in 2017, sitting in an open-backed truck that transports villagers from Port Moresby to Irupara, which is my wife's father's village, about 120 kilometres southeast of Port Moresby. I was travelling there with Heather Horst to test an app that we'd built for part of that research project that Georgia mentioned previously. And I overheard a song playing on the truck stereo system, and I recognised it from many, many years previously, but it was a different version. It was in the local language, And from my recollection of hearing that song, it had been composed by someone actually in Irupara, in the village, someone that my wife was related to. And so when I got to Irupara, I asked around about that version of the song. I can't remember what the song name was now, had other things to do. And more importantly, where I might be able to get it. Because in the past, that song would have been released commercially on cassette or CD or SD card, or even so obtaining a copy once back in Port Moresby would have been really straightforward. I could have gone to the shop and bought it. But the only way of getting that song, as far as I could tell, was to find someone who had a copy on their phone and ask for a copy to be shared either via Bluetooth or using a local sharing app such as ShareIt. YouTube in the village at that stage wasn't really doable. It might be now. I guess the other thing I could have done is just search for it on YouTube. No one I knew had the song, and it seemed out of place to be walking around the village asking people if I could get a copy, and I didn't end up getting a copy. The reality of this, it was a song that was produced on someone's laptop or computer, most likely in Port Moresby at the time, because there was no electricity in the village then, mains electricity anyway, and then circulated through sharing, through people who knew people. And as part of discussions Heather Horst and I were having in Port Moresby at the time, that was a very characteristic way in which music circulates. And so over a number of trips between 2017 and 2019, Heather and I explored how people in urban PNG shared music and how these apparently free but actually digital data-based commodities operate as people navigate what we have described as sort of ecologies of data, and certainly economies of data. So when I talk about a data-based commodity, I mean, a file, although it appears free, when data is very, very expensive, it is a commodity in the form of transference of data. And I'm not going to go through the details of all of this, just parts of it, but Heather and I have recently published an article called We Just Share It. And Share It is the name of an app that's commonly used in Papua New Guinea to allow local sharing. You don't have to be connected to the internet. So I could update people's versions of Google Chrome on Android phones using ShareIt. We didn't have to be connected to the internet while we were in the village. And so the focus of that was on urban identities and how, say, church groups connect through music, how metal fans connect through music and so on, and how some of the kind of urban groupings of which church and, say, metal are really good examples, how those groups kind of compare with, I guess, what we would call more common, or certainly group sharing that I was more familiar with, language, clan, village, sort of regional based groups, which is the way things have been in PNG. And so whether it's Hillsong Gospel, Hillsong is a kind of gospel church in Australia that's huge, has some controversies around it, but its music has spread to Papua New Guinea, or whether it's death metal. People are sharing and using music in PNG, but with distinctly Melanesian approaches to how it circulates, gets listened to and discussed. That's hardly surprising, of course, but it is important in understanding musical value and function. Underlying processes rather than kind of obvious stylistic markers are significant, and that's something that we're really interested in. Just to sort of put this in perspective, I remember in 1996, or 1997 maybe, I'm not sure, but Steve Feld and Bambi Schifferlin were coming through Port Moresby, and I think around the time that the dictionary was taken back to people in the Kaluli area, and Tony Subam and I, a musician, went down, met them at the Gateway Hotel, and we took Steve and Bambi to the Chinach Mint shop, where Steve bought sort of ludicrous amounts of CDs and things, because that was the way you could kind of get up to speed with what was going on with music in PNG at the time. And that, lasted through, I guess, through the early 2000s. But that's no longer the case. If you can't get a kind of an overview in a simple way like that, possibly through YouTube now, but that's a kind of, it's a bit of a mess as well. And it's, it's kind of, it seems to me that there are two sort of poles in operation. There's the kind of very, very local sharing approach through closed WhatsApp groups and so on, and then there's a much more wide open, the wide openness of something like of YouTube. Anyway, I won't go through the anecdote, I'll run out of time there, but much like cigarettes and betel nut, data in the form of what's called flex cards, but cards for about, so these flex cards are 5 kina. These are ways of getting credit on your phone. So data has become sort of, I'm going to say as important, but it's kind of sold in the same way that cigarettes and betel nut is sold. And the economy is quite kind of similar. And people seem to me to be not dependent on data, but data has become a kind of important part of managing an urban and to some extent a village life in PNG. And that there's more details on that in that article. Now, the final article that I want to refer to is something that Monica and I have very recently published. It's not available online yet, as far as I know. An article that tries to establish some guidelines or ideas, a framework as to how we think about recorded music in this, where there's this tension between a kind of commercial background or commercial history and its much more fluid kind of sharing, whatever you want to call it, process or whatever's going on at the moment. And so we have borrowed what's I find a rather annoying Facebook meme. I don't know, Kirsty, if this is the same for you or Dawn or other people. Music must go ahead. So there's an expression that I often see on Facebook, which is work must go ahead. Work must go ahead, yeah, which means, work must go ahead, stuff must go ahead. It's like a way of sort of saying, we need to keep working, a kind of dedication to continue work or a project that's been started, despite the fact that there might be obstacles. And we have attached music to that. Music must go ahead, or la musique doit continuer. It's an article in French. As a way of kind of saying that irrespective of whether or not there is a working kind of industry, irrespective of commerce, recorded music carries on in a very important kind of a way. And that is best off being seen as kind of part of a much wider ecosystem of musical value and musical creation and musical sharing that has a lot more to do with local practices of social reproduction and so on than it does about a music industry. Now, because I come from a kind of background, I guess, of looking at music from a more popular music studies perspective early on, where that kind of sociological industrial structure is been a really important part of how a lot of popular music has been studied. But it sort of seems to lose relevance in the context of the work that Monica and I have been doing. So, so you've got ways things are shared, how to think about this, and then how this kind of relates to commerce. And sorry, just skipping through things, thinking about the time here. About 10 minutes to go. Is that right, Georgia? We'll finish in about 10 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, 10, 15. Give some time for questions. Thanks.
So with those things in mind, what we're trying to do is examine the significance of contemporary music and performance with kind of dual registers of economic vitality on the one hand and social reproduction in Melanesia on the other. So global precedents and rapid technological change in the music industry, even if that's even what it can be called anymore, mean that attitudes towards authorship and ownership require scrutiny, with a particular focus on how music can play a role in value creation beyond kind of sort of narrow economic calculations and ideas. And that's particularly important as Vanuatu in particular, as I mentioned at the beginning, and Papua New Guinea try and find ways of introducing copyright law and talking about how music might operate in this environment. So as an example, in Vanuatu at the moment, for example, there's have been kind of two ways of thinking about music. There's music as sort of traditional cultural expression, custom music, if you like, and then there's popular music, which is kind of connected more to what I guess Australian musicians or US musicians would understand as a kind of, more copyright-based approach to ownership and collection agency and so on. And so we want to explore how music that is recorded is actually functioning in the same way that many traditional cultural expressions are, and how that is a tension between it's a tension with how copyright is being implemented in places like Vanuatu. And with the idea that music is neither, the recorded music we're talking about here, neither sounds necessarily like the music that people would associate with traditional cultural expression, and it's certainly not necessarily circulating in the same way or being created in the same way, because there are these kind of technological mediations as part of it all. And so one of the ways that we're thinking of looking at this, and this is quite current. In fact, the most recent developments of this just happened to me this morning, in fact. But I am going to bring it in and finish with playing a little bit of music, because I think it's kind of important as to where this research goes. And that's about looking at song traditions through recorded music and how they bear a similarity to what are commonly called, on Vanuatu at least, traditional cultural expressions. And so preparing this last night, I needed an example of a song tradition, and an updated one, a kind of post-COVID one of a recorded song tradition. And my wife is in Moresby at the moment, staying with relatives. She's doing some work there. So I sent her a message this morning, in fact, and I said, hey, can you send me a Paramana Strangers song, a kind of reworking of it, because I'm interested in playing some music rather than just talking for 40 minutes. And that seemed like a good example. Ollie Wilson's published on that as well, so it kind of seemed like a good angle. But instead, what she sent me was a kind of newish version of a song that we both know very, very well, called Kakeni KR. And I'm going to briefly play a little bit of that. This is the most recent version of it. Someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear that. That's one version. That's the recent version. It'd almost be like the version of the song that I heard on the truck. It's a different one. And then why that's familiar to me is from a song back in the 1990s, a George Luff version. It's a remaking of this song. So these are screenshots from a video. I don't want to show video on Zoom because that's dreadful, but and this is a kind of particular era of PNG video production that will be familiar to many people, I hope. And then I kind of carried through this, having a look, and I could find actually on Apple Music of all places, Memahusa, who's another generation again, further back from George Luff. And then finally, I always seem to keep looping back to string band, a sort of 1970s. ARP Konenai. Now, what is important here, it struck me, is that this song has been recorded by numerous artists over numerous years, quite famous artists, not from this particular place, but it's actually a song from my wife's village. IRP Konenai refers to Irupara Konenai, the place we were just a few weeks ago, doing a ceremony for her late father. Kekeni Kaya is one of her aunties. And so it kind of interested me, that she'd sent me this song because it connects us and connects me and to this place to some extent. And that is a very different way for me to think about how other music in my life, non-PNG music in my life, connects. Sorry, I've just lost my notes there. I do not know of a single song that I either play or listen to in my non-PNG world that has a link like that. And so that phenomenon, linked to the difficulty of obtaining music other than through some sort of personal connection at one end, as I mentioned, or the vastness of YouTube at the other, has led to a number of questions that I think we should be following through around ownership and authorship and so on. How are people more broadly connected to particular songs and musicians? Is this something that's just happening to me? Extremely highly unlikely. Are there links in the people who are singing these songs across generations? I know in some cases that's the case, but I'm not so sure in this case with Memahusa, for example. And what does that mean for matters of ownership and authorship more broadly as copyright comes into play here? And just to very sort of finally loop this back to work and ideas that Steve Feld kind of posited in 1996. As recordings, they're going to be examples of the kind of schizophrenic mimesis that Feld spoke about in the sort of George Luff days of Kekeni KR, when he said, a quote, "The recordings retain a certain indexical relationship to the place and people they both contain and circulate. But at the same time, the material and commodity conditions create new possibilities," as we all know. It's quite a well-known quote. And he finally kind of points out that the question of how recordings open up possibilities in new, different or overlapping ways to face-to-face musical contacts or to other historically prior or contiguous mediations remains both under-theorized and contentious. In 1996, now, of course, with things like ChatGPT and artificial intelligence coming to music, the internet, mobile phones, developments in digital formats, the internet networks, and the uneven spread of these, with Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu being, I think, the very uneven end of the scale, certainly in terms of access to data and cost of data, things are still under-theorized and contentious, at least for the kinds of places and conditions we're exploring here. The situation has become more complex, if anything. The imbalance is greater, and the kinds of industrial relationships skewed more to transnational IT than music industry, and that's something that I've written about in a recent book called Code Musicology, which does draw on these ideas. So I think with that in mind, bearing in mind your kindness that this is a kind of work in progress, I would very much like to stop there and open up for discussion, if that's okay.
Thank you, Denis. That's great. And I'm sure there's lots of questions to come. Maybe we could take off your screen share and see if it will work with videos for a little while, even if just people asking questions would like to put their videos on when they're speaking, and if it starts freezing up again, we can all turn them off. Yeah, so I'll open the floor. Please just unmute yourself or put your hand up if you have a question.
Morning, Don. Didn't see you before, Brian. Lots of people. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, lots of people.
Sorry, I didn't notice any of these people coming. So thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, we had a few join after we started, which is great.
Sally.
Great. Well, I'll sneak in with my Kirsty. I'll pass over to you. I won't be greedy and hog the question floor.
That's fine. Thank you, Denis. It was wonderful to hear those musical examples at the end. It was, very heartwarming, and it's such interesting work that you're doing in so many ways. And I'm glad too that some of my work has resonances with yours too. So thanks for that. My work currently has a linguistic focus, and I'm looking at Pacific Creoles, Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu and Solomon Islands, recording those languages. My daughter's in the bathroom. I may be quite short just now. And my question was about the use of Bislama and the frameworks, how people are talking about things. You've got those publications you shared with us, Music Must Go Ahead and Me Want Them, Music Blomi, Hemi Blong Everyone. So you've got a real grassroots take on how music is being used. And then you've got, strikingly very differently, the English language music national, the music policy, the Vanuatu national music policy in English. So I guess I'm wondering, does that policy exist in Bislama? If it does, are things expressed differently, or how much is that English language and that literacy angle kind of really shaping those discussions about copyright and music ownership?
Yeah, so this is new, the policy. Thanks, Kirsty. That's a difficult question that I don't think I'll necessarily be able to answer. All I did, I managed to just grab a copy of Stan's copy of this. He only brought one copy with him to Sydney, and I scanned it and sent it to James and Monica. So all I know of is the English version at the moment. Jean-Pierre is a fluent French speaker, probably happier in French than he is in English. So one only assumes that as this is implemented, the materials will be in Bislama. So I don't really know, but I could certainly put you in touch with Stan, who would be able to answer that directly. But
sure, I guess yeah. I was just thinking about that would you say the distinctive Melanesian way of sharing? You talked particularly about distinctive Melanesian kind of concepts, and I just wondered how well they translated. But I guess we'll see if they do translate this document and it becomes available.
Yeah, it's what struck me when you asked that question was sort of moving between the very specific language, say, of IRP Konene, hula, the vernacular, which people recognize but don't necessarily understand that IRP means a particular beach and KR is a particular person, with policy in English, with songs in Tok Pisin, but that's Vanuatu and PNG, isn't it? So all those things are constantly held together at the same time, and people navigate that. And perhaps, sorry, I don't want to be incoherent. It's
No, that's
Not much of
fine.
an
It's
answer,
a
but
very,
that's kind of all I've got.
that's all right. That's all right. Respecting your work in progress here, and it's a very interesting conversation in progress. Thanks, Denis.
Great. Don, did you want to ask your question next?
Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you. Thank you for the presentation, Denis, and I'm sorry to be one of the people who joined you late. So forgive me if my question was answered at the beginning of your presentation, but I'm really thrilled. I also warn you, I keep getting notices that my connection's unstable and it's freezing up occasionally here. So apologies on all these many levels. So my question is just very briefly. I realize the main focus of your talk has been about the importance of music reproducing social relationships in people's lives and so forth. And obviously this is of extreme importance. However, my question is more of perhaps an old-fashioned one in thinking of how, at least in the past, becoming a musician was hoped to be a way to make money off of your music. And with the demise of recording companies, of selling of cassettes, CDs, whatever, in shops by companies and so forth, are people no longer interested? Are there other ways to make money from their productions? Is it just an altruistic creation that people are doing, that they're more interested in the social relationships, maintaining these, than in any monetary gain, which would be very surprising if that were the case, but I look forward to what you may have to say in relation to that. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Don. And yeah, so it's neither one nor the other. We interviewed musicians who were earning tens of thousands of kina from performances. We interviewed a CPIC band that had earned 25,000 kina from a single performance at a CPIC function in Port Moresby in 2018, I think, or 19. And Sprigamek, the rap musician, he frequently earns quite good money, I believe, through gigs at Cosmo and, people. So what I'm saying, yeah, the answer to your question is there are people who are looking to make an income from music in some sort of vocational sort of sense. But at the same time, a lot of the music that is circulating is completely not in that world. And the problem, I guess, I see with things like copyright, which kind of sort of tries to sort of level the playing field, but says, well, this is the way it is. If you wrote this song, you're going to get the, and you can get the royalties from it. And it's just not that simple in a place like PNG, where these sort of social reproduction functions are so much more kind of vibrant and common. And so, yeah, I guess the answer is there are people that are trying to earn a living in the same way there are here. But things are changing so quickly that the way you make money or the way that you earn an income is changing very, very rapidly.
Okay. So mostly from live performance, you're saying?
Almost exclusively from,
right.
as far as the difference in income was so sort of astronomical between live forms and other forms. But then, often, you've got the added complexity. I haven't even started to go down this road. It was just a sort of a note I made a couple of days ago. Alcohol, the reason that they're making big money from getting gigs at the Cosmopolitan in Port Moresby is because people go to the club and drink. So, that's where there are obviously some pretty serious implications and tensions there as well for social reproduction,
Right.
Thanks, Jody.
Thank you, Denis, and thank you to Georgia for hosting these events. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks,
Don. Yeah. Jody, did you? You've got your hand up, I can see.
I do. Yeah. Hi, Denis. Thanks for your thoughts and lots of those questions. First of all, I just wanted to make a comment that working with popular music artists in Arnhem Land, Western Arnhem Land, so many of the things you described, the sharing of music, the way that musicians will take on songs and rewrite the words and recreate them in their own form, but then you think that's the original song with different lyrics. Really similar, and it was really thought-provoking. In Australia, as you know, we have APRA, which helps us to gain income from songwriting, from copyright. And I assume that's the kind of some of the organisations that you'll be looking at as part of this process over there. One of my questions was, first of all, have you considered TikTok in all of your studies? Because I'm finding that TikTok is having a really interesting influence on the music industry here, and particularly in Arnhem Land or in Aboriginal music. It's huge, and there are these stars, people like Mitch Tambo that went through a reality TV talent quest and now has quite an established career. He actually started on TikTok, so it's kind of interesting. So I just wonder whether you've looked at TikTok in Vanuatu at all.
No, not yet, but I might, yeah, we must, absolutely. Yeah, no, thanks, Jade. And it's really heartening to hear that there's a sort of resonance there. But I am aware of how important TikTok is in other ways, how quickly it kind of develops. But yeah, thank you. It's definitely something that
it's really interesting, the sharing on TikTok that happens, where you can actually divide your screen and play along to songs and things like that.
Right.
So,
and the algorithm. So sorry, you go. I sort of interrupted.
Yeah, like I've found it's quite fascinating how my colleagues are really into TikTok. There's a couple of them particularly get on, and they play with musicians all over the world, so they're kind of jamming together, sharing songs, and so that adds another whole element to the these, where the traditional forms of sharing are being kind of moved into these forms of data sharing online.
And the fact that with TikTok, I believe, not having many followers doesn't damage the algorithm, right? You can be on it and you could suddenly have 1 million followers, as opposed to something like Twitter or whatever, which is quite different. Yeah,
that's right. Like your videos can go viral quite independently of your profile, which is quite different to the other forms of social media sharing. So yeah, and I think it's also interesting, one of the things I find with TikTok that influencing the way music's kind of produced and thought about is that the clips are often very short, and you can go really big on one song. So recently I went to in Newcastle a Indigenous music event, and the headline act I'd never heard of at all, and it was he was a TikTok star, so he had this one song that had like millions of views and created quite a bit of revenue for him, but none of his other songs were known by the audience either. So it was kind of this thing of this, wow, this is actually really focusing on how you can just have one moment or one little dance move that takes off. But I also wanted to comment on this idea, perhaps as well, with this idea that copyright and if you get copyright happening and all the music streaming services, and like in Australia, whether you're Indigenous or not, but in the music industry, most people are not making money out of recording. Recording's like advertising, really. Spotify, the band that I work with, we've got like 80,000 streams on Spotify from our EP, and we haven't, that hasn't even generated $500 for us. So it's really worth thinking that these kind of sharing stuff is going on is perhaps not as damaging on the economics of the music industry as we think. I love all the sharing by phone and stuff like that.
I should do a plug for this, and sort of another side of all of this is coming up with this idea of or extending this idea of what I think is a code musicology, so that a lot of the things that we're talking about are ultimately kind of mediated by code. So I've written about that recently, trying to find a word for it, that, you know, as musicologists, we are increasingly unable to distance ourselves, even if we want to, from the code that underlies a lot of what's going on, whether that's algorithms from TikTok or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll look at that one. Thanks so much for your insights. Certainly really interesting area of research.
Thanks, Joe.
Jane, and then we've got two more questions, Jane, and then Rita, and then we'll finish things up.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Dennis, for a really interesting presentation, and thanks to Georgia for continuing to organize these talks. It's a nice little change of focus in the day, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Jane.
A quick question for you, Dennis. Would it be possible to get a copy of that policy? As you probably are aware, there's been a long history, like over 40 years of contention in terms of copyright issues going on in the Eastern Pacific. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of see how other people are approaching the formulation of policy, the thinking about it, even if it's on an administrative and more technological approach to it, as you said. I think that would be quite informative. And then my other thing is just, it's more a reaction than a question, but I have to say, and so I get the idea that you're looking at social processes versus stylistic things. I think that's super, super important. But I have to say I was blown away by your last, or the two most recent examples, because they sounded like they could have been lifted off Tahitian, radio at those time periods. It's amazing. And aside from the harmonization and that kind of aesthetic of sound, it sounds like something I could hear in Tahiti. And so I'm wondering if we still don't need to consider these wider circuits of sharing and of circulation. And I can't help but wonder, because it's not a sound I hear in a lot of other places, if there's not a French connection in there somewhere. And I just don't know, but I was blown away when I heard those. So thank you. Thank you for sharing.
I think that might be, I don't know, but I suspect that's a sort of feature of that particular part of the coast, the Arama coast. There's a lot of, ukulele playing and rhythms that are undoubtedly drawn from popular music that has come from Eastern Polynesia. There's no question about that. I hear it in my house all the time. Family loves it. People are trying to play those rhythms and things. So yeah, for sure. But I'm not sure that how much wider that necessarily is in PNG. That would be an interesting thing for someone to have a look at, actually.
Yeah. Because it was the rhythms, but it was also just the whole general sound, and also kind of like the hula rhythm of it, the very danceability of it in terms of Eastern Polynesian dance styles. So I'm just
there's a man like passed away now, and there was a murder in Dirupara, and they refer to his name as Cookie because he was from the Cook Islands.
Yeah.
And there's and obviously the missionaries there were Rarotongan, and a lot of there are songs Peravetta still sung in Rarotongan in that part of the coast. So but as I say, I'm not sure how much further that goes.
Interesting. Okay, thanks so much.
Great. And last question from Rita.
Hello for everyone. It's been a while. It's lovely to see familiar faces. Shout out to my supervisor, Sally. Hey, Sally. Thanks so much, Dennis, for your presentation. It was such an interesting topic for me, and it really made me think of Samoan band music in that way as well. Acknowledging your work in progress, I thought maybe I'd like to share some interesting things that have happened to Samoan band music that you might want to look up as well. It was 1999, I recall the song came out. It was a well-known remake. It was a remake of a well-known love song called Sosefina, and everybody was playing it over in New Zealand. It was like this amazing the vocals. This man was singing the Samoan song that our parents' generation used to play on the cassette tape. And then we had, and then we were teenagers and we could hear the song and we were like, whoa, he sounds amazing, almost like R&B type of voice. And then our, amazement when we found out that the singer was actually Fijian. So there could be a link between, crossing across the Pacific in terms of music. But what happened was that he made the song so famous. Sosefina is a Samoan song about a young girl named Sosefina, but Fiji was singing it. And he's a well-known reggae Pacific artist. So what happened was that maybe around the 2000s, it was so popular that when Fiji went to Samoa, he was not allowed to sing the beloved Sosefina that everyone knew, because the owners of the song then wanted to take back their, they wanted to protect that song and keep it just within their circles. But his song is out there on Spotify. Everyone listens to his version. And so that's an interesting story. Another one is there's a band named Puniala Va'a that have a history in the 60s and 70s of producing, some of our much loved Samoan classics. And in the 90s, when bands wanted to do remakes and modern versions for the new audiences, Puniala Va'a turned around and said no, because they learned from the lesson of Fiji and the other song. And so what Puniala Va'a did today, now their children are adults. Their children have continued Puniala Va'a 2.0, if you like. And they're remaking the songs of their parents. And so they've kept the music within their, they've held on to the legacy of music. Another interesting third one I'll share with you lastly, there's a song, it's almost like a Samoan anthem called Tu I Lunga by a Samoan New Zealand artist, Lole. Her song, came out in the early 2000s. But what happened is because of Facebook and remixing, and everyone can just remix their songs over the phone now, a guy named Wayno remixed it, put it up, and it became so famous. He took his song and blew it up. So this is from Samoan to Samoan. But she must have reached out to him and said, that's my song. You haven't acknowledged me. He ignored her. And then within 6 months, she was out on Facebook, like posting publicly. And then it kind of created this, Wayno is this gifted young musician, but at the same time, people were like pointing and calling him out and saying, hey, respect, with our Samoan musicians. So those are some interesting things that I thought of straight away when you were talking about, this whole remaking of music and appealing to the modern listeners today. But it's such an important, personally, I love listening to modern day versions of old songs.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
I also love listening to the old stuff, and I always find it interesting, the differences in how they play out. But yeah, I just wanted to share that, and I can email you some links to those examples.
Yeah. Thanks, Rita, because that is so kind of, again, heartening and kind of energizing for me to hear that. Really, yeah, but that's fantastic. And I keep going back to that thing that Feld said, they're recordings, and so they're complicated how they circulate. Their material and commodity conditions create new possibilities, and we're always going to be dealing with that. So yeah. I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And my house will very much appreciate playing the songs. I know that. I think we're at time. I've got a union bargaining meeting to go and do, from the kind of pleasure of this to the fire of that. So.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks everyone for all those great questions, and thank you so much, Denis, for that fantastic presentation. Yeah, I hope everyone can come back next month. I think it's the 16th of March. I'll send out a note. Sam Kip, Patrick Wonder, Jumpy Jumper Patrick, and Harry Susanto are doing a collaborative presentation. And yeah, I hope to see you all for that. And I'll keep updating the schedule as well at the bottom of emails, so you can see if there's new people that have put themselves forward to present this year. Yeah, so thank you, Denis, and thank you, and we'll see you all next month.
Thank you, everybody.